we would start with our first keynote of today. As I already said, Sean Randolph from the Bay Area Council Economic Institute, and he's mainly working on collaborations between the Silicon Valley and other innovation systems in the Bay Area Council. And he's also looking at the dynamics that other innovation systems have to the Silicon Valley. And one question we have on Sean maybe is if we need maybe here in Stuttgart a kind of Silicon Valley. So we had yesterday the quote from the CTO of Trumpf, who said that we are a kind of Silicon Valley for the manufacturing industry. So it would be very nice to see your thoughts on this topic and your perspective from the Silicon Valley to Europe. And come on stage. We are very lucky to have you here.
Well, thanks very much, Mark, and thanks all for being here this morning. Really appreciate the work that has gone into organizing this conference by Mark and Guido and all their teams. Terrific job. You have a wealth of people here at this conference from the west coast of the US, and I'm obviously one of them. I'm going to try to bring a short perspective on a question that we get a lot of conversation with European colleagues on, which is about the connection between Europe and Silicon Valley, meaning the Bay Area, through startups. And why and how is it that so many hundreds of technology startups come from everywhere in Europe every year to the Valley? So we were asked to take this on by the European Commission last year to give them some metrics and some indicators for just what that dynamic looks like. And there we go. So first of all, why is the question even being asked? Well, from a European Commission standpoint or any European perspective, Europe has lost a lot of ground in the last 10 years in the technology space. There's a lot going on, but relative to advances, say, in China, Asia, and the US, Europe has lost some ground. In 2006, 17 of the most valuable companies in the world were European. Today it's 7. Europe's share of major ICT companies has been falling back relative to the US and Asia. And if you look at billion-dollar-plus valued startups, especially in technology, currently about, I think, 139 are North American, about 83 are Asian, about 44 are European. So the perception is Europe has lost ground in the last 10 years, and how do you make it up? Well, there's a lot of ways to do that, but one way that governments have chosen, including the European Commission, but virtually all the national governments, is to support startups, because Silicon Valley has really excelled at creating young companies that grow very, very fast, very dynamically. Typically, they can pop up and expand hugely in 4 or 5 years. Europe less so. So can Europe actually do the same thing and create high-value growth companies by supporting entrepreneurs? First of all, it's a very dynamic scene. I think you all know that. We find that the major cities, the major clusters for where entrepreneurship is growing fastest are, number 1, London, but also Berlin, Paris, Amsterdam, and Stockholm. They have the numbers, the facilities, the connections to industry, where just in numerical terms, this is where the action is most concentrated, but it is not only there. There's a host of other cities across Europe. Those are just a few, and I apologize if your city is not on the list. There are a lot of cities that could be on the list, that are also really dynamic places and have really become scenes in the last 4, 5, 6 years. Very often that is due to a particular dynamism or synergy between the entrepreneurial sector and key industries that are based there. For example, if you look at Berlin, It tends to be really strong in creative industries. However, Munich is really, really strong, especially in things relating to engineering and manufacturing, which is not so strong in Berlin. Or you could look at Eindhoven in the Netherlands, that's really strong. Guess who's headquartered there in Eindhoven? It's Philips, and they're really strong in engineering-based startups. So a lot of different competencies across Europe in both larger cities and smaller cities as well. So mirroring that, where are the largest startups concentrated? We'll call them scale-ups. These would be companies that have about $100 million or more that they have raised. And same story, if you throw in Spain as well, France, UK, Sweden in particular, and Germany. And you can also measure the same way dollars raised. You can see a similar pattern. Of course, if you lump the Nordics all together, you have a pretty critical mass there in the Nordic region as well. So virtually every government in Europe has taken on its own strategy about how to support technology startups. Typically, it's going to be some combination of tax credits, usually around R&D. It's going to be around grants for startups, usually very small but significant grants for early stage companies. And most European governments are investing in venture funds, typically co-investing with private investment firms. But the European Investment Fund is actually extremely strong, remarkably so from a US standpoint. They directly account for about 10% directly of all venture capital in Europe, and their funding leverages about 40% of all the venture activity today in Europe. So a big commitment at the national level, but a very, very big commitment also at the EU level. So there's some challenges. Why are they doing that? Why do they need to do that? Well, one of the big issues is that there is not enough venture capital available yet in Europe at the right kind of level. So for the most part, there is plenty of early stage startups grants. There's plenty of angel investment, no lack of that, and there's a pretty good amount of Series A funding. The problem comes when you start to get to larger scale funding, to growth capital, Series B, especially Series C. The more volume of capital is required for growth, the more scarce it becomes. And you can just see the numbers sort of dropping progressively as you get into that kind of higher funding space. Some other issues out there that startups face. One is there's limited access to stock markets. If you're going to do an IPO outside of London, there aren't a whole lot of places you would go. If you want to be acquired, about 50% or so of all the tech acquisitions happening in Europe are done by American companies of European startups. Another factor is the relatively small scale of European venture firms. Typically, they have about 20% of the scale or funding available as a typical US venture firm does. And their investments individually tend to be similarly much, much smaller, which again gets you into that question of is it Series A or B or C or something else? And also, I know there is an exception to everything I say today. You could probably think of 10 right now. But for the most part, the people who are the partners in the venture firms are coming out of large companies or banking. In the US, it's a little bit different. They're typically former entrepreneurs who have started multiple companies and succeeded. And it's just a different kind of perspective that they bring, but I think in Europe, one of the consequences is their investments tend to be more conservative, a little bit less bold, not aiming quite as much for the transformative changes. So this is kind of reflected here. You can see the composition of where the money in the European firms comes from. Big, big role of government. In the US is overwhelmingly private. So again, sort of a different character and a different perspective in terms of where the money's coming from and reflected to some degree in how it's directed. So the good news is this is getting better. When I first looked at this maybe 3 to 4 years ago, it was a pretty static picture. In the last 3 to 4 years, there's been a lot of momentum growing in Europe on these fronts. There is more capital available. There is more later stage funding available across Europe now than there was before. There are more successful entrepreneurs who have founded companies and are now themselves becoming venture investors, and more successful entrepreneurs who are now willing to mentor early stage companies, all of which is great. It's not a solved problem yet because, in fact, the amount of the funding, even though there's more later stage money available, is still a lot less than it is in Silicon Valley or the US, but nevertheless, really remarkable, important advances in all these issues in the last, I'd say, 3 to 4 years. There's some other issues. These tend to be particular to individual countries. One, though, is market scale. And a lot of this, when I'm talking about startups, it's based on many, many conversations with startups that are in Silicon Valley from Europe, startups in Europe, mentors, investors there and in Europe, and people running accelerators in Europe and in the US. And one question is scale, that even the larger European economies don't have the scale of the US. If you have, or you still have a lot of cultural and regulatory barriers in Europe that make it expensive to do business on a European basis if you have limited resources as a startup. In some countries, labor law is a factor, harder to hire and fire people in a dynamic way you may want to as a startup, or may need to. Some countries, taxes are a factor. Just generally speaking, these are more cultural regulatory issues on the national level, but they tend to make it costly to grow or difficult to really sell and develop your business at the European level. So, Silicon Valley, what's the connection there? What role does the Valley play today in this whole dynamic? Well, there is a really remarkably large infrastructure in the Valley, and when I say the Valley, really San Francisco, Silicon Valley, the same thing here because they've largely merged, that organizations, both governmental and private, that provide support to these small early stage companies with the objective of making them successful. So there are more European governmental offices in the San Francisco Bay Area than anywhere else in the US outside of Washington and New York. And you can see quite a range. We've got a lot of consulates. The interesting thing about them is, in contrast to a lot of the US, a major part of their job is helping startups, being technology bridges between their country and Silicon Valley. There are a lot of national governmental technology offices that are there to facilitate technology connections, including helping startups get connected in the Valley, and it's even going to the subnational level. And the European Institute of Technology, EIT Digital, has a very active office there, focusing especially on the digital economy. There are a lot of accelerators. There are a lot of accelerators, period, but there's a significant number that are purely European. They may be sponsored by European governments. They may be sponsored by a combination of European governments with private sector partners, and some are just purely private sector. For example, the Belgian Chamber of Commerce operates a really dynamic, terrific accelerator right in the middle of San Francisco. Then there's these large accelerators. They may have, 60, 80, 100 companies at them or more that are not European in nature. But when you look at where in the world are the startups in those accelerators coming from, in every case, the largest segment is coming from Europe, as opposed to Asia or anywhere else. Then the European business organizations. So these are all binational, and most countries will have these, cities will have these. But again, like the consulates, like the governmental presence, all of them have a focus on startups. It's not the only thing they do, but they all have as a major part of their mandate how to connect and introduce startups from their countries into the Silicon Valley environment. And sometimes they all kind of combine together. Silicon Vikings, which I love the name, it's all the Nordic countries together working to do exactly the same thing, and they actually support one accelerator that brings all the Nordic countries together at one facility. This is where I think it kind of gets interesting, the corporate presence. So we talked yesterday in some of the breakout sessions about large European corporations, corporate accelerators. I've counted about 50 large European corporations across many, many different sectors that have innovation offices in the area. That can be a dozen or two, up to hundreds of people. And typically they're doing several things. They are interpreting Silicon Valley back to their headquarters to help them understand what's going on there because they need to understand it. Maybe pick up some of the culture. They're bringing leading executives through periodically to see if they can kind of tune into the Silicon Valley way of thinking of the trend. Very often they are partnering with large companies. Maybe it's Google, maybe it's Intel, whoever it may be. Very often they're partnering with universities. And what they're also doing, what they may also do is if you're a company, say, like Spotify, and you run on a platform like maybe Facebook, you're looking to develop relationships with those big platform companies that help you expand globally. And they're also looking for startups. Even the biggest technology companies that have large R&D budgets of their own realize very often startups are innovating faster than they can. And so they're not walking away from their own R&D, but they're actively searching, pretty much every one of them, for startups, European, from China, from the US, it doesn't matter where really, that they can support, maybe acquire, maybe incubate, that can help them advance their business model. And you can see it's every industry you can think of just about. It's not just tech companies, it's automotive companies, it's retail companies, it's a pretty wide range. And guess what? They have venture arms. Those venture arms may be co-located or part of the innovation offices, or they may be separately organized, but there's a really large and growing venture presence by these European companies. So again, why do these young companies come? Basically, they're accessing growth capital. It's not the early stage. They've got the early stage capital. It's the growth capital primarily. If they're thinking about IPOs, it's a place to be. If they want to get acquired, their odds are probably better of being acquired than anywhere else that they could go to. Scaling is a big issue for all of them. They're looking to scale into the US and globally. Partnering with platform economies and also platform companies, they're also looking for mentors and looking for seasoned partners. So there's a lot of people in the Valley who have started companies multiple times. They have global experience doing that. They have the marketing background. And they're often looking for those kinds of people to bring into their organizations. What do they find? Well, as I pointed out earlier, the infrastructure is very supportive. There's lots of help available for them. It's a very open environment. You actually can get access to very high-level people relatively easy. You're introduced around from person to person to person. Doors tend to be pretty open. There's a large pool of risk capital available. A lot of investors tend to think big. So if you're thinking big, that opens doors. What they also find, though, is it is really expensive. It is the most expensive place in the United States to locate and run a business. Everything is costly. Housing is insane. And so that's the factor, and also intense competition for talent. It's a huge pool of talent, but people are jumping engineers between companies constantly. They're expensive, and if you're a young startup coming in from another country, you're competing against LinkedIn and Google and Facebook and many other large companies with large benefits. So the competition for talent is extreme. But this is interesting. How do they grow? If they actually succeed, what happens? Typically what happens is that, and again, there's all kinds of variants on this. If they're successful, the founder team or one of the founding team may move to the US, may move to Silicon Valley. They may put the corporate headquarters there, or they may not. They may stay at home, or they may split the leadership between two countries. But even if they do put the headquarters in the Valley with a European subsidiary at home, the fact is the roles are complementary. What they do in the Valley tends to be accessing the capital, the growth capital, the global scaling, and the marketing. Typically, almost all the engineering is done at home. If you ask them, where are your engineers? They're in the country they came from, or they may be from all across Europe. And that's because, guess what? The engineering talent is just as good here. And also, it's a lot cheaper. So you don't have to deal with that high cost and competition for talent. So very complementary roles. If they don't leave the home country, they tend to actually become many dual national companies. So how can we make the bridge stronger? The system, I think, works pretty well for everybody. Something's going on, the digital single market, that can help potentially create more of a pan-European market, more so than there is now. GDPR may be an issue. It's a cost factor. Compliance for smaller companies, we'll see how that works out. Privacy, the duty of care here in Europe, again, a risk and cost factor for smaller companies. We'll see how that works out, but both things that could inhibit growth in Europe. Data localization, same kind of thing. I've talked to startups that say, hey, where in country X we'd like to go into Germany or we'd like to go somewhere else, but it means we have to put our data on their server. We can't do that in all these different countries. It's expensive, so we're just going to go to the States. So those are factors. Capital Markets Union, can Europe create a pan-European venture capital market? That would be really helpful. Most venture firms tend to, except for maybe the UK and parts of Scandinavia, tend to invest in their home countries. Is there a way to scale that so that a startup anywhere in Europe could have reasonably good access to venture capital from anywhere else in Europe? That would be a good goal. And then some of these national tax and regulatory policies are more at the national level. So I think the final point here is, on our side, what we're seeing is the accelerators are focusing now, the national government ones and the private ones, on somewhat later stage companies. The early stage companies, they found, were kind of getting oriented and educated, but they weren't showing a whole lot of results in terms of growth. So now a lot of these accelerators are focusing on companies that have a little of capital already at home. They already have a product or close to having a product. They kind of know what they're doing. Now they're ready to scale. And I think we're seeing a shift toward those somewhat later stage companies coming over than the early stage true startups we saw at the beginning. I think there's a big opportunity for accelerators from Silicon Valley to expand in Europe now. There's so much talent, there's so much opportunity here, there's so much synergy with Europe that rather than sitting back and saying, hey, come to us, why don't we come to Europe? And we're seeing that as a small but a growing trend now with a lot of our major accelerators now establishing facilities across Europe, some in partnership with major European corporations, which is a pretty natural way to go because they have partners and anchors in Europe who really know their industries very, very well. And at our end, startup fees would really help. I hear again and again from startups from everywhere, it is really hard if you want to stay more than 3 months to get a visa to do that, especially if you want to get a company off the ground and raise capital. So that's on us, given our immigration policies right now in the States. I'm not holding my breath anytime soon, but it's something we need to do. So the bottom line, it's a two-way relationship that I think delivers a lot of value on both sides. Silicon Valley gets constant infusions of energy and talent. That's just great. It's connected to the rest of the world through all of these people who come through or often stay for long periods of time to start companies. Europe gets companies that are growing faster than they would have probably had they just stayed at home. Companies that get more capital, and actually these companies typically create more high-value jobs at home than they do in Silicon Valley. So that's a plus. And I think finally, this illustrates the kind of role that Silicon Valley plays as a global innovation platform. The question has come up, should Stuttgart or other cities try to recreate Silicon Valley? And I'd say, no, don't bother to. I mean, it's its own thing. It works in its own way. It grew up organically. There's no playbook for it. So why bother? But every place has its own unique assets. in engineering, in manufacturing, and in other fields. And every one of those is an opportunity to leverage and then come to the Valley. If there are takeaways, things, ideas that could be imported, learnings, okay, that's great. As we were saying, scale there, attract capital there, partner there, a variety of things. But I think there's a lot of opportunity here in Europe to develop synergistic relationships in the Valley and leverage those to grow here in Europe. So that's my talk. I think there's a lot of really exciting work to be done, a lot of great momentum in Europe, and we look forward to helping those partnerships happen at an even larger scale. Thanks.
Sean, thanks for your call.
I have been looking for this. I've wanted this cookie.
Now you can eat it. Yeah?
Yes,
So before
not in
before
front of
leave.
you, though.
I hope it tastes well. Thank you, Sean.
Great. Thanks, Mark.